Chapter 14. Magical? Had Willie lost her mind? Duke too? I don't know what stories your government tells you in America, but magic doesn't exist, I said. Not here and not there. I laughed and waited for them to join in, but they didn't. It's the stuff of children's fantasies, I added, sobering. The hope glinting in their eyes vanished. Willie looked as if she were trying not to cry. Do you, or do you not, possess magic? She said again in a thin, strained voice. Going by a shocked expression, she doesn't, Duke sighed. Forget we said anything, Miss Steele, and don't tell Mr. Glass about this discussion. He'd have our heads. But Matt said it's warmer when she's near, like it's responding to her. She believed his watch reacted to my presence too, and I thought Miss Glass was the mad one. Don't, Duke warned. Enough now. He was mistaken. He's never mistaken. Willie's face crumpled. About anything. Ever. She turned and ran up the stairs, taking 2 at a time. I stared after her. I didn't know for how long. Time slowed. The air thickened. My breaths sounded laboured and my blood felt sluggish. Magic. The word rattled around in my head. I grappled for some clear thoughts, but they were like ribbons tossed by the breeze. I would grasp the end of one, only to have it ripped from my fingers before I could gather it all. The hand on my arm brought me out of my trance. Miss Steele, Duke said gently. Are you all right? I nodded numbly. Duke, what did Willie mean when she asked about Mr. Glass's watch responding to me? So you felt it? His fingers tightened. It does speak to you? No. So, what is it? How does it work? Why does it glow like that and make his veins glow too? If he said magic, then I'd... What? Pack my things and leave? So you've seen it, he said. You've seen it work on him. I nodded. But how does that watch help Mr. Glass feel better? I don't understand. It doesn't, he said heavily. That's the problem. It used to, and now it's broken. Broken? It used to make him feel better for longer. He could go days without needing to use it again. Now it's only a few hours. I see. Do you? I shook my head. He sighed. Thought so. He glanced up the staircase. Best forget this conversation ever happened, Miss Steele. Best not to mention it to Matt. He won't like that we told you about magic. Why not? Because he didn't want me to know he was as mad as them, as mad as his aunt? Because it's a secret. From me? From everyone. It was clear from the expressions at the breakfast table that they held little hope of finding the watchmaker on the final day of the search. Even Miss Glass seemed forlorn, and she wasn't aware of what was at stake. Perhaps she was simply anxious because she knew her nephew was leaving the following day, although she continued to deny it. When she caught Duke and Cyclops discussing departure plans, she scolded them for wasting time on nonsense. As we were about to leave, Willie signalled me to speak with her in private. If she started spouting about magic again, I would walk away. I refused to be taken for a fool. After spending many hours lying in bed thinking about what she and Duke had said, I'd managed to see through the veils they'd been trying to cast over my eyes. What I saw was just as worrying, however, as Mr. Glass being the Dark Rider. He must be an opium addict, or if not opium, some other potent substance that made his veins glow. The watch was a clever device that hid the substance in liquid form. It likely also hid a tiny syringe that he used to inject the liquid into himself as he held the watch in his palm. Whether it was also a functioning timepiece remained to be seen. Clearly, the device had stopped working properly, so he needed the original maker to fix it. I'd never seen such a watch before, so it most likely required special care. I hadn't yet worked out why he couldn't inject the substance into himself without using the watch, but there must be a reason. I did not plan to tell any of them that I knew their secret. I did plan on telling the police that I'd found the Dark Rider, just as soon as I could get away. "You must do your absolute best to find the watchmaker today," Willie told me. She took my hands and wrung them so hard I had to ask her to let go. "You know how important this is? You know." I didn't tell her that it was almost hopeless, or that the police would be stopping them from leaving tomorrow. Perhaps. Oh, I didn't know what to do. Perhaps I ought to remain silent. No one had harmed me. Indeed, Mr. Glass had saved me from Abercrombie and the thugs and seen that I was well cared for. To betray his trust would be cruel. Besides, if they left tomorrow, they would no longer be England's problem. As far as I could see, they'd done nothing illegal here anyway. He tried to engage me in conversation in the carriage, but I wasn't keen to talk. I was in turmoil, not only about telling the police, but also about his addiction. Should I try to help him? Could it explain his outlaw ways? If he was desperate for opium and couldn't afford it, then he would need to steal to pay for it. Perhaps if his addiction went away, there would be no need for criminal activity. "You're very quiet today," he said. "Am I?" He smiled crookedly. "Thinking about how much you'll miss me when I'm gone?" I rolled my eyes, thinking about where I'll live and what I'll do, which only reminded me that I hadn't asked him for a reference yet. I was about to when he said, "Perhaps we'll need to postpone our journey. Even if we do find the watchmaker, there's no need to hurry back. I like it here. London intrigues me, and to be honest, there's not much to keep me in America. Your friends and Willie will be disappointed. They don't have to stay. Disappointed to leave you behind, I mean. They're very fond of you, and I of them. And if you stay, you will require my assistance." It wasn't a question, for I knew the answer before he spoke. He nodded. "I would like you to help me. Would you, on the same terms?" My gaze slid to the window. I don't know. I don't know what to think anymore, about anything. He leaned forward and rested his hand on mine. It was probably meant to be a reassuring gesture, but it made my heart skip to a more erratic beat. "I'm sorry. I'm not the easiest of men at times." I blinked at him. He did not remove his hand, nor did I want him to. "You have nothing to apologize for." Not to me. He'd been the perfect gentleman at all times. Hot tears rushed to my eyes, and I had to once again look out the window so he couldn't see. His thumb stroked mine, gentle and insistent. My breath hitched at the intimacy of it. I shouldn't want him to touch me like that, not this outlaw, this addict. But I couldn't bring myself to tell him to stop. I simply sat there and allowed him to do it. "India," he said, his voice low and rough. "May I call you that?" I nodded. He let me go, but only to touch my chin and gently force me to look at him. "Then you must call me Matt or Matthew from now on." I nodded again. "I know we're not friends," he said. "Not really, but I feel a connection to you, and I hope you feel the same with me." I sucked on the inside of my cheek. I nodded again, unable to speak, and not daring to disagree, not wanting to. "Good. Then, I need to say something to you. He let my chin go and rested his hand on his knee. He lowered his head and shook it slightly. After a moment, he looked up. Why is a remarkable woman like you not married? That wasn't what he wanted to say. For starters, it had been a question, and yet he'd said he wanted to say something to me. So what had been on his mind? Was he going to tell me a magical watch was keeping him alive? That he was addicted to opium? Or that he was an outlaw? The carriage slowed and he leaned back. He wasn't even interested in my answer. The first watchmaker on the list was a Mr. Ingham, a short round man with a bald head and a pair of spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He took one look at me and inched away from the counter. I stood to one side as Mr. Glass, Matt, spoke to him about Kronos. As Mr. Ingham told him he didn't know anyone fitting that description, my gaze fell on the newspaper spread out on the counter nearby. The main article was about the Dark Rider again. The police believed he was here in London based on information received from their American counterparts. As Matt turned to go, Mr. Ingham glanced at me, then down at the paper and up at me again. He scooped it up. Good day, Miss Steele. Good day, Mr. Ingham, I said, and followed Matt out of the shop. We accomplished a great deal, visiting many shops and only stopping for a quick bite to eat and for Matt to use his watch while I powdered my nose in a Wandsworth inn. We did not have any luck, however, and headed back to Mayfair in a thoughtfully grim mood. That's all the watchmakers I know in the city, I said. There are others, of course, but I've never met them. Even if you do remain in London to continue your search, you don't require my services anymore. I can't help you. He'd closed his eyes upon settling in the carriage, and now he raised his eyelids slowly, halfway. The effect lent him a lazy, dissolute air. I beg to differ. You're familiar with London. I'll need a guide. Cyclops knows where we haven't been. He can drive you without my guidance. He closed his eyes again, and I thought he'd fallen asleep, when his eyes suddenly reopened. He grinned. It was so unexpected that I couldn't help smiling back at seeing the change in him. I've got it. You can be my aunt's companion. Me? A lady's companion? I snorted. Don't be ridiculous. Why not? You're honest. He held up a finger. Easy to get along with. Another finger rose. Kind. He lifted a third. And my aunt likes you. There, it's settled. You'll live with her. Where? At your house, or is she moving back to Lord Rycroft's after you've gone? He rubbed his forehead. It looks like I'll be staying. I want you both to live with me. I didn't say anything, and he didn't seem to require an answer. He closed his eyes again and tipped his head back. After a moment, his head tilted to the side, and his breathing became even. He'd fallen asleep. I had to shake him awake when we arrived back at the house. He didn't look at all refreshed. Rather, he looked wearier than ever. Why didn't you use your watch again? I asked before I realised that I'd just told him I knew what he used it for. He eyed me closely, and my heart stopped. I swallowed. Would he hate me for knowing about his addiction? He didn't answer me, but got out and unfolded the step for me. I took his offered hand and climbed down. He did not let me go when my feet hit the pavement, but tightened his grip. Matthew. I didn't know why I said his name. If I'd planned on asking or saying something, it immediately flew from my mind when he drew me closer. Yes, he murmured. His small finger hooked mine. We stood as close as my skirts would allow, his face only inches above me. He looked exhausted, and yet he was still so handsome. His illness didn't lessen that. "You should go inside to rest," I said, stepping back. He didn't let go of my finger. "India."
"She's right,"
Cyclops called down from the driver's seat.
"Go inside, Matt. Rest."
Matt turned his frosty glare onto his friend, but let me go. As Cyclops drove the carriage off, I headed up the steps. Willie opened the door, but the hope in her eyes soon vanished.
"You look awful," she said. "You should rest."
"I know," he snapped. Willie's chin wobbled. Matt sighed and drew her into a hug. He kissed her forehead. "Sorry, I'm going up now."
"I'll leave some supper on your desk,"
she said, as he headed to the staircase with plodding footsteps. Duke and Miss Glass emerged from the dining room. Embroidery thread looped around Duke's hands and connected to the spool Miss Glass held. At my raised brows, he said,
"Tangles,"
with a shrug. Someone knocked on the door and Willie opened it. A grisly-looking man in a brown coat and skewed mustard-coloured tie stood on the stoop. No less than 5 police constables, dressed in their distinctive blue uniform and helmet, squeezed onto the porch behind him.
"Is Mr. Matthew Glass here?"
demanded the man in front.
"Who's asking?"
Willie said, hands on hips.
"Detective Inspector Nunce, Scotland Yard."
"There's no one here by—" "I'm Matthew Glass," Matt said, placing a hand on Willie's shoulder. She shoved him away.
"Matt, you know why they're here."
"Willie, it's all right." Nunce stepped inside without being invited. His constables followed him like a tail.
"Mr. Glass, you're under arrest."
"No!" Willie cried. One of the constables caught Matt's wrist, but he pulled free.
"What's the meaning of this?"
he demanded.
"You're under arrest on suspicion of being the American outlaw known as the Dark Rider."
Nunce jerked his head, and the 2 constables grabbed Matt, one taking each arm.
"There's been a mistake,"
Matt said, his voice calm. "I'm not an outlaw."
"Let him go!"
Willie lunged at one of the constables holding Matt, only to be caught from behind by another.
"Get off me!"
She kicked and lashed out, but couldn't reach the man behind her. His arm locked around her waist, and he dragged her out of the way. Her screeching grew louder.
"You're under arrest too,"
Nunce told her.
"What for?"
she shouted.
"For being a member of the Dark Riders posse."
"You're a damned idiot fool."
"Let her go,"
Duke said, stepping forward. He tried to separate his hands, but only managed to get himself more tangled in the thread.
"God damn it!"
he shouted, resorting to brute strength and still failing. Miss Glass dropped the spool and came to stand by me. "Stop this at once," she said with haughty crispness. "There's been a mistake. This gentleman is my nephew, and the nephew of Lord Rycroft. Release him at once." Nunce touched his hat brim.
"I cannot, ma'am. He's the Dark Rider."
"Who or what is the Dark Rider?"
"American outlaw. Don't you read the papers?"
She bristled. "Of course not. I've no interest in idle gossip." Nunce signalled for another of his men to grab Duke.
"Take him too. Sounds American."
He sized me up.
"She's English," Matt said. "Friend of my aunt's. I hardly know her."
Nunce grunted, but didn't order anyone to arrest me. One of the constables took hold of Duke's arm, but Duke jerked away. The constable tackled him, and with his hands still tied, Duke couldn't defend himself. They both crashed to the floor.
"That was uncalled for,"
Matt growled. Nunce merely shrugged. "Duke!" Willie screamed. "Duke, are you hurt?" Miss Glass's fingers gripped my arm. I closed my hand over hers, hoping to reassure her somewhat. I don't think it helped. She could most likely feel my body shaking through the connection.
"Contact Commissioner Monroe,"
Matt instructed Nunce, struggling to pull free of the 2 constables who held him.
"He'll set you straight." Nance snorted. That's what they all say. Willie stomped on the toe of the bobby holding her and managed to pull free. She ran to Duke, who was struggling to sit up on the floor, but was caught again by the long-limbed youth in uniform. She smashed her fist into his cheek, drawing blood, before he grasped her hands and twisted them behind her. "You're hurting me!" she cried. Matt lurched to his left, using his superior weight and height to force the constable on that side to stumble. The one on his other side also lost his balance, and Matt was able to pull free of them both. But his freedom was short-lived. The last of the constables threw a punch at Matt's jaw. While Matt managed to dodge it, the interruption gave the other bobbies precious seconds to recover and throw punches of their own. One hit Matt's mouth, the other his stomach. He doubled over, coughing. Miss Glass whimpered and clutched her throat. I turned her so she wasn't facing the scene and patted her back. Yet I felt anything but soothed myself. My heart thundered and every part of me shook. "Stop at once!" I shouted. "Inspector Nance, control your men. You're upsetting an elderly lady with this unnecessary display." But it was Matt who responded, not Nance. He stopped fighting. "I'll go with you," he said. "Willie and Duke too." "No!" Willie shouted. "Why should you go, Matt? You've done nothing wrong." "We'll sort it out at the station. Vine Street?" Nance nodded. "Check they have no weapons hidden on their person," he said to his men. His constables checked pockets, removing every item they found and placing them on the hall table. Among the handkerchiefs and coins sat Matt's special silver watch. "Take them away," Nance said. Willie and Duke gasped. "Your watch!" Willie cried. "Matt!" She struggled against the constable, trying to force her through the door. "May I take my watch with me?" Matt asked Nance. Nance pursed his lips, looked at the watch, looked at Matt, then said, "No, you have no need to tell the time in the holding cells." A bead of sweat trickled down Matt's temple. His breathing turned ragged. His face was the colour of cold ash. The two constables on either side of him marched him forward. "He has to take his watch," Duke said to Nance. "Please, it's important. He'll die without it." "Die?" Miss Glass sobbed into my shoulder. I tried patting her back harder, but it was useless. I couldn't offer support when I needed it badly myself. My gaze connected with Matt's over the top of her head. What I saw in his eyes brought burning tears to mine. His illness savaged him, yet it wasn't that which made my heart ache. It was the sorrow and disappointment I saw in his face. He thought I'd betrayed him. He thought I'd told the police that he was the Dark Rider. He wasn't the only one. "You did this!" Willie hissed at me. "No," I said, "I didn't." But she shouted over the top of me and couldn't have heard. "You heartless witch! If he dies, I'll come looking for you. I'll cut you up." "Willie!" Matt's sharp voice could hardly be heard over her ranting. Nance and his constables marched Duke and Matt outside too, and my heart sank even further when I saw Cyclops join them, restrained by another two bobbies. Everyone seemed to be shouting. I caught snatches of pleas, begging Nance to allow Matt to have the watch. The inspector continued to refuse. "It's her fault," Willie screamed. "You've condemned him to death, India." I shook my head, but they weren't looking at me and wouldn't have seen. "If he doesn't get that watch," she continued, "his death will be on your conscience."